Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 Radical Rescue, released in 1993 for Game Boy from Konami, is the third and final Ninja Turtles game to grace the original Game Boy, and quite a departure from the previous two games in that it's more of an exploratory, non-linear action game as opposed to the usual side-scrolling fisticuffs you usually get with these early Turtle titles. Is this shift in direction enough to make this the best of the Game Boy trilogy, or is it too much of a departure for some folks to swallow? Full disclosure, we're playing this once again off the Cowabunga collection for the sake of I don't have the original cart. It's crazy expensive, so this is the better read, cheaper option. Go ahead and have a cow. If this bothers you so much, I really don't care, and neither should anyone else with half a functioning brain, but I digress. So the game begins with Michelangelo storming the latest Foot hideout to rescue his brothers and Sensei, and I guess April's missing too. She apparently gets kidnapped once a day, I'm told, from the clutches of the Turtles' quote-unquote newest foe, the Cyber Shredder. Anyway, this is a non-linear game. There's an emphasis on exploring, but your journey at first is still linear enough that before you go dig deeper into this foot-infested mine, you'll need to rescue your fellow turtles, since each one possesses a unique skill that will aid you, the player, progress further into the game. For example, old Mikey can use his nunchucks as a makeshift propeller to slow his descent, Leonardo can drill through weak floors, Raphael can retreat into his shell and fit into narrow passages, and Donatello can climb walls. In addition, there are also other items such as keys and key cards to open up more parts of the map, heart containers to extend your life meter, and whole pizzas that serve as an instant revive when your health goes down. And health is something to keep in mind because you only have one life, and unlike previous Turtle games, all four turtles share the same life meter, which is totally bogus. It's like they had that one character with all four abilities ready to go, but since we need 4 turtle characters, they split that one character into 4 and gave each quarter a move. So you're left with instances where you're constantly swapping turtles for whenever the situation calls for a specific skill to be used, and it's really quite cumbersome and also quite pace-killing as well. That said, the game does give you 2 continues, and there's also a password system in place. Continuing in either fashion will usually place you at the last checkpoint you passed, for example these gates that require a keycard to open up. Passwords can be obtained by accessing the map screen and are relatively straightforward affairs. Speaking of which, the map screen is fairly rudimentary compared to what you get in later similar games. You have a general layout of the complex with some dots to indicate key items in certain rooms, and these dots disappear once you've acquired these items. Your only other indicator is a flashing dot that points out your current position on the overall map, but that's about the extent of it. There's no highlighting previously explored rooms, and you have no way of knowing which rooms connect to each other until you actually physically explore them. So like I said, it's a fairly rudimentary map overall, but it does get the job done. Mostly. If there is something to be said about Radical Rescue, it's somewhat of an ambitious title to go in a more non-linear approach, especially with this franchise and this platform. And I want to say that it almost works out. The base gameplay is fairly solid, the ideas are there. I'd go so far to say that out of the 3 Game Boy titles, Radical Rescue is probably the best of the bunch, not just in terms of being more open-ended, but generally being a more well-rounded experience as far as the core gameplay and controls are concerned. Each turtle plays the same save for their unique skill, hit detection is not quite as wonky as it was in past games, and the controls are tight and responsive. So on the surface, you've got the makings of something truly great on hand here. Just about the only real quibble I have with this game, aside from the minor points mentioned, and this isn't really a knock on the game so much as I feel it's a missed opportunity, I feel that Radical Rescue doesn't really go far enough with the concept. Yeah, there's some exploration to be done, but it's mostly a means to get from point A to point B, usually entailing seeking out keys or key cards to open up the next path, or finding the captive turtles to overcome some obstacles to reach the next level. The only extras to be found are the handful of life extensions hidden throughout the game, and the whole pizzas that you could collect, one for later storage, get out of the room, and then grab another one that'll regenerate to restore your health to full on the fly. Most paths will lead to dead ends where finding some extra item would have made the journey worthwhile. Radical Rescue, despite being presented as non-linear, is still rather linear. Again, not a real knock on the game because it's still quite the piece of business. But I'd like to think that had this come out 5 or 6 years later, maybe on the Game Boy Color, you would have had something, I don't know, more symphony-esque. Or at least Metroid 2 quality, which would have been more realistic. That could work too, but what we have here is still quite fine. Radical Rescue looks fairly decent. Not quite as exceptional looking as the previous game, which really went out of its way to beef up the overall presentation, but what's here is still fairly good. The character sprites are somewhat simpler looking but still well drawn. The bosses look menacing enough. The overall layouts are nice, dark and gloomy, even if the visual variety is somewhat lacking. Sure, there's only so much you could do in terms of scenery when most of your game takes place in a mine, with occasional dips into tech bases and great outdoors, but still they could have done some mild pizzazzing with the backdrops. Game runs at a decent pace, slowdown and flicker is very rare here, a fine looking game overall. In terms of sound, you've got the familiar Turtles theme that plays in the opening segment and in the outdoors, but then the rest of the game's soundtrack is somewhat generic sounding stock music. There's a couple ominous tunes that play as you get deeper into the mines that sound alright, but nothing too spectacular or even terrible, it's just there. Sound effects are also quite accurate, no voice samples or anything like that, but what's there gets the job done and that's all you could really ask for. Overall, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 Radical Rescue ends the Game Boy trilogy on a high note with a great game that goes in a new direction, does a good enough job of it, and yet leaves you wanting just a little more to make the whole package seem more complete. Or at least something that could be comparable to Metroid 2, which was a Game Boy release from years prior and did a little more. As it is, it's still a tremendous game that does what it does pretty damn well, and to see this get re-released in a relatively affordable compilation means that more people who missed out on this the first time around can give this game a shot, and you probably should. Definitely a highlight in the Ninja Turtle gaming library and one of those overlooked Game Boy gems that I'm happy to see get a new lease on life.